You know, one of the lines that has become clear to me in Kendrick Lamar's performance last night is 40 acres and a mule. And that line is particularly potent for many Black Americans. And it happens to be a line that I remember from my education growing up in grade school in the Bronx. And I vaguely remember what it was about. It was something that was promised enslaved people. I can't remember whether I was told it was before or after emancipation, but it had to do with the Civil War. And I've since had my memory refreshed, and it was something that the federal government promised enslaved people that they would get, and it would help them get a head start. But as with many promises given to Native Americans, they didn't come through. And I never really equated 40 acres and a mule because it was not something that really ever touched my life. But in thinking about it this morning, I never really equated it with something else that was very important to American life, which was the Homestead Act. Now, if you don't recall the Homestead Act, for some reason, there's a lot of American history that really stayed with me. And the Homestead Act was an act that the federal government felt was extremely important because they wanted to populate the Midwestern part of our country, the prairie. And so they offered 160 acres free and clear to people who would farm the land, ranch the land. I guess it was really only good for farming, but they would give free and clear 160 acres to people, and they had mapped out a huge swath of prairie land. And it was white people who took that land, and that's how a lot of our Midwest cities came into being. And they didn't rescind that promise. They gave 160 acres to people free and clear. And all they had to do was stake it out. And this may be apocryphal, but I seem to remember in class hearing how there was a date and they had people lining up and they set off a bell and you could just go and stake out your plot of land and it was yours and you could farm it. And that was the beginning of generational wealth for a lot of white people. A lot of these people came from Germany and Middle European countries, and they got a stake in this country. And here we have enslaved people who were brought over against their will and finally released from bondage and promised for their servitude they would be given 40 acres and a mule, and a mule, and they got nothing. And they had to start from scratch. Just a thought. Think about that. Think about how you'd feel if that promise was made to you, and then you were just blown off. Okay, that's it. See you next time. It's Helen Cassidy Page. I haven't been on here for a couple of days, but I wanted to, looking at my timer, I'm not sure what's going on there, but I wanted to come on here and say once again, thank you so much. I have had so many new followers, and I want to thank you for coming on here and showing support for me. And I'm trying to think of something to talk to you about that kind of relates to the video that I posted that got so much attention from you, which was about the Homestead Act and how I feel there is a corollary to the line in Kendrick Lamar's halftime show, which was 40 Acres and a Mule. And that was, as we all know, a broken promise to the recently emancipated people. And in the late 19th century, the federal government offered 160 acres to settlers who would go to the Midwest and stake out a claim on the prairie. And I think Black Americans were entitled, but I don't think they really had an option to do that. I think that was mostly settled by white Americans, and I think the message was clear. The federal government wanted whites to settle that land, which to me is another slap in the face. And that video got a lot of attention. And so I thought, since I have so many new followers, I would let you know a little bit about me and who I am and what it is about me that made me make that video and make me feel so strongly about some of the inequities in American life, and particularly the racial injustice in this country. So, first of all, some things to know about me. I'm a knitter. I am on here knitting, and this is a great passion of mine. I learned to knit from my Aunt Nellie, my mother's sister. When I was a little girl, we used to make trips to Canada. I grew up in the Bronx in New York, and I currently live in San Francisco in California. I've been here since 1957. I am now 85 years old. I don't make any bones about that. I'm perfectly fine with letting people know how old I am, how young I am not. I am a writer, an editor, and a life coach, and I have an active practice in all three of those areas. And I am also Irish American, and that's in part what I want to come on and talk to you about. I'm first generation. My father was born in Ireland, and he also died in Ireland. He went back to pay, as he told my mother, a last visit to his mother and father's grave, and he had a heart attack on the farm where he was born. It was a shock to all of us, but looking back on it, it was sort of poetic. I always felt my father had one foot in Ireland and one foot in this country, which I think is true of a lot of people who were born in Ireland at the time that he was, which was in 1898. It was very difficult for people of my father's generation to make a trip home, as they called it, because it meant they had to travel by steamship. It was expensive. It was just hard to do that. And my father was one of 14 children, and half of his family lived in Ireland, and he loved them, and he had to leave them. I know this story that my mother told me about my grandmother, was that it was so hard for her to say goodbye to her children on the dock because she never knew if she'd see them again. So there were hard times. After my father died, my mother and I, 3 years later, my mother and I made a trip to Ireland. It was my first trip to Ireland. She wanted me to meet my relatives in England, where she was born. Her parents were born in Ireland, and my family in Ireland. And I had sort of a temperate relationship with Ireland at the time, but that trip changed my life dramatically. I came away from Ireland having fallen deeply in love with the country, with the people, with my family there, and I was not expecting that. As a result, 20 years later, I wrote a novel, which I think is the work of my life. I have 55 titles on Amazon. I've written a lot of books. This book consumed me for a good part of my life. And it's set in the 1800s, prior to the Irish famine, and it's centered on the Irish famine. And I did not grow up knowing much about the Irish famine. I knew it took place. For those of you who don't know very much about the famine, potatoes were a source of nutrition for poor people around the world. They were an easily grown crop. They produced several harvests a year, and they were a staple crop with some sort of dairy. They formed nutrition for poor people from Peru to the serfs in Russia, and the Irish farmers, the peasants in Ireland, subsisted on them for generations. In the summer of 1845, farmers around the world went to sleep with their crops flowering at that time of year, and assuming that they would wake up to a flourishing crop. But what happened was that they woke up to a terrible stench, and the potato crop around the world had died. They called it a blight. At the time I was writing my book, which I think started about 20 years ago, the prevailing belief was that it was a fungus that traveled in drops of water. It was a very rainy summer. I think scientists have changed their opinion about that, but at any rate, potato crop around the world perished. In Peru, in Germany, in Russia, in France, in Belgium, and Ireland. However, Ireland was the only country that starved. And the reason for that was because all other governments fed their farmers. England, Ireland was a colony of England at the time. England let the Irish starve. It basically was a Holocaust. And I discovered this when I began researching for my book. And there was so much I didn't know about Irish history, and it was such a revelation to me. And my views on justice and injustice and judgment had changed long before this. I was in my 60s, I think, when I began to write this book, and I think my views about the world and how people should treat one another had formed long before this. But I also had many important revelations when I began working on the book. And I see I'm going to run out of time, so I'm going to pick this up another time. I think to understand where I was coming from when I made the video the other day, I'd like you to know this about me. So I'll talk to you again. Thank you very much. Hi everyone, Helen Page again. I'm going to try and finish up the video I started just a little while again. I can go on and on and on, and I will try to make this short. Two things. First of all, happy Valentine's Day. And also, I mentioned that I took a trip to Ireland with my mother 3 years after my father died. And I said that I fell in love with Ireland on that trip. And please don't think that I am touting Ireland as the most wonderful country in the world. I have been around the world. I have visited many countries. And I've fallen in love with all of them. I love to travel. I love to learn about other cultures. Ireland was a very special visit for me, in part, I think, because my father visited there and died there. It is my culture. And I had a very special trip. And it was where I learned about the famine, and it touched a nerve. You know, if there's any fate in life, that was a trip that opened up a window onto a part of history that I really didn't know about, and it led me to a project that I think is in part the work of my life, which is writing about the Irish famine. So while I did fall in love with Ireland, I don't mean to suggest it is the be-all and end-all of cultures or countries. It happened to be the one that is very important to me because it's part of my roots. If you go to your origins, I'm sure you would have the same experience, and I honor and respect that, and I hope you're able to do that. Again, I'm knitting. I've made a little bit of progress on my sweater, and I want to get back to some things that I learned in researching the Irish famine and why it is so important to me, and I think why I felt moved to make a public statement about the Homestead Act and what I feel were the inequities in the Homestead Act, and comparing it to the promise made in 40 Acres and a Mule, and why I think it is so vile for the government to have made that promise, and then Andrew Jackson came along and simply turned his back on that promise to people who just had suffered the worst degradation. I'm not quite sure where I left off, but during the famine, the potatoes died. They died around the world. I'm not sure if it was a fungus, a bacteria, something killed all of the potatoes. And as I said, or as I meant to say, Ireland was the only country that starved. There was no, even though potatoes fed all of the peasants in every country around the world, Ireland was the only country that had a famine and that starved. And that is because the British Crown, that was a colonizer at the time, turned its back on its subjects and allowed Ireland to starve. And I read that, and I developed this furious, angry feeling towards England. And I can remember sitting at my computer just enraged that they would let these people die and starve. Ireland had a population of 6 million people at the time the famine occurred, and at the end of the famine in 1851, famine hit in 1845, and it was over in 1851, and the population had shrunk to 3 million. 1 million people died of starvation, 1 million died of famine, fevers, and diseases, and 1 million people left Ireland for countries like Canada, the United States, Australia, and other places. At the time I started my novel, which was in the late 90s, it still had not returned to the population it had at the beginning of the famine. It since has, so that's how long it has taken Ireland to recover from the famine. Back to my feelings of anger towards England, and I was thinking, the brutality of the Crown to just let Ireland starve, and it had pictures in the newspapers of the Irish as monkeys, it just regarded the Irish people as subhuman. And I'm sure that there are people in this audience now, if anybody's watching this, that can relate. That is a common tactic when you want to diminish people, is to regard them as subhuman. And I would read these things, and it just infuriated me. And not because I took it personally as someone of, Irish descent, but just the cruelty of it. And then it struck me, well, that's kind of like the pot calling the kettle black, because that's what my country has done to American Indians, to African Americans. That's what the Japanese did to the Chinese during the 1930s. That's what the Israelis have done to the Palestinians. That's what the conflict between India and Pakistan, go on and on and on. It is what happens when the strong dominates the weak. And it was a very sobering moment. And it's not that I haven't known that before. It's not that I haven't been sensitive to it. It's not that I have been going through life brutalizing people and not been aware of it. It's something that I have abhorred in my life. But somehow working on that book and coming face to face with it and having to write about it put it in a different perspective for me. And I think it was around that time that I made a vow to myself that even though I, I think I've tried to be a good person in my life, I think many people say that, but I'm not sure what we do to really accomplish that. So many of us, and I'm including myself, give lip service to that. But I made a very conscious vow that I would try to eliminate judgment from my life. And I think judgment is at the root of of racism and a lot of cruelty in life. We think we're better than other people, so we can do and say whatever we want. And I'm sure from that moment, around that time, I have tried to eliminate or control judgment. I know I'm not perfect. I know I continue to be a judgmental person. I think we're judgment machines. At least I am. I have to admit that. I work very hard at being accepting and I do feel the world would be a better place if we could simply embrace and accept one another. It is the way I want to live. It's the way I want to be treated. It's the way I want to treat other people. And I do my best. I fall short so often. And that is really why I made my video. I heard so many people talking about 40 acres and a mule. It struck a nerve. It almost brought me to tears. What that meant, what the reversal of that promise meant. There is so much about, I feel that the effects of racism is the scourge of this country, and it absolutely breaks my heart. And it struck me, here we had the Homestead Act that just flew in the face of the promises made in 40 Acres and a Mule, and that's why I made the video. That's a little bit about me. I guess I wanted you to know this. Be well, everyone, and take care.